The Verith ship had no name for what it was looking at. That was the first problem. High Surveyor OSSVEL stood at the center of the skin deck and watched his instruments argue with each other. The readings came in, got processed, got flagged, got reprocessed. The room hummed the way it always hummed, low, controlled, efficient. Everything on a Verith vessel was efficient. That was a point of deep cultural pride. Efficiency meant survival. Efficiency meant the Dominion had been expanding for 60 years without losing a single major engagement. The thing drifting at the edge of scanner range was not efficient. It was not much of anything, by the look of it. A human vessel, that much the instruments agreed on. A frigate class, medium weight, designation UES Carrion Wake. The Dominion database had a file on it. 11 years old. Active. Well past its rated service life. Expected status, decommissioned, probably scrapped, certainly not flying through the Kepler Veil frontier at 0.4 standard velocity like it had somewhere important to be. And yet, OSSVEL had ordered the scan as routine procedure. They always scanned before making tactical decisions. It was efficient. The scan was supposed to take 20 minutes and tell him what he already suspected: damaged human ship, running on low power, probably lost, probably not worth a torpedo. He would log it. He would move on. The scan took 4 hours. Not because the instruments were slow. The Verith had the finest scan technology in this sector of space. The readings came back fast. They just kept coming back wrong. Junior Analyst Toon stood at his station with the particular stillness of someone who was trying very hard not to have a reaction. He was young for a Verith, which meant he had only been doing this for about 30 years. He was precise. He did not make mistakes. He had never once in his career submitted a report that contained a reading he couldn't explain. He typed, instrument error, probable, at the bottom of his first log entry. Looked at it. Deleted it. Typed it again. OSSVEL didn't comment on this. He watched Toon work and said nothing. That was its own kind of answer. The hull of the Carrion Wake was the place the instruments fought hardest. The ship's structure came back as 14 distinct patches of metal, 14 different repair jobs layered over each other over 11 years of active service. 3 of those patches were not military-grade plating. The scan identified them as compressed civilian cargo hull material. The kind of plating you found on freight haulers. Transport ships. Things that were never meant to be anywhere near a combat zone. One section at the rear of the ship was very slightly radioactive. Not dangerously. Just enough for the instruments to notice. Enough for Toon to spend 20 minutes cross-referencing the radiation signature against the database before he found a partial match, a class of reactor casing used on mining platforms in the Outer Belt systems, discontinued about 9 years ago. Someone had taken a piece of a mining platform and put it on a warship. Toon stared at this for a long time. He typed, instrument error, probable, again. Deleted it again. The structural integrity reading was the number that nobody on the scan deck said out loud. OSSVEL saw it. Toon saw it. Every analyst in the room saw it. The Carrion Wake registered at 31% rated structural integrity. In the Dominion fleet, a ship was decommissioned, by law, by procedure, by basic common sense, when it dropped below 60%. Ships at 60% were considered dangerously compromised. Ships at 60% got their crew transferred and their hull cut for parts. The Carrion Wake was at 31%. It was also, by every observable measurement, flying normally. The engines were running. Not well, and not at full power, but running with a kind of stubborn consistency that the scan instruments had difficulty categorizing. The Verith system flagged low-power readings as signs of distress. It was designed to. A Verith ship running at reduced engine output meant something had gone wrong. It meant systems were failing, crew was in trouble, the ship was limping. The Carrion Wake was not limping. It was cruising. OSSVEL walked the length of the scan deck slowly, reading the screens as he passed each station. The ship's navigation system came back as a hybrid, original factory hardware running alongside components that the database couldn't fully identify because they weren't military issue. Civilian parts. Probably purchased through non-standard channels, probably installed by hand, probably not rated for the conditions they were currently operating in. The ship was flying through contested frontier space on a navigation system held together with parts that weren't supposed to be there. It was holding a perfectly steady course. He stopped at Toon's station. Toon looked up at him. He had the expression of someone who had run out of rational explanations and was standing in the gap where those explanations used to be. The readings are consistent across all 3 scanner arrays, Toon said. His voice was very level. I've run the cross-checks 4 times. I know, HFY said. The ship should not be operational. I know. Toon looked back at his screen. I'd like to flag these as instrument error. HFY thought about this. Flag them however you need to, he said. He moved on to the next station. The internal scan of the ship's crew quarters came back while HFY was reviewing the weapons data. 12 human life signs, all strong. The crew of the carrion wake was, by all biological indicators, fine. Moving normally. Breathing normally. Going about their day. 1 crew member was in the engine corridor doing what appeared to be manual repair work on a plasma conduit junction. 1 was in what the skin identified as the medical bay, running equipment checks. 3 were off duty, in crew quarters. 1 was at the weapons array, working on something the skin couldn't fully categorize. And 1, the pilot, according to the crew manifest the database had on file, was at the helm. Asleep. HFY stopped walking. He looked at the reading again. The pilot, Pete Callahan, 26 years old, born in a city called Boston in a part of Earth called Massachusetts, was at the helm of a ship traveling through contested frontier space, and his biosigns showed the slow, regular pattern of voluntary sleep onset. The ship was flying itself. Through the Kepler veil. While the pilot napped. Toon's voice came from across the room, carefully neutral. Pilot is showing sleep indicators. I see it. Should I flag that as? No, HFY said. He stood there for a moment. Behind him, the hum of the skin deck continued. The instruments continued to argue. The carrion wake continued on its course, steady as anything, pointed toward Varith space, 31% structural integrity, 14 different metals in its hull, a piece of a mining platform on its back, its pilot asleep at the wheel. HFY had been a high surveyor for a long time. He had scanned 400 ships in his career. He had never written a report that he didn't understand when he finished it. He looked at his screen. He started writing. He did not understand it. 14 corridors away on the carrion wake, Pete Callahan slept deeply and without concern, the stars sliding past the view screen above his head, a half-eaten sandwich sitting on the console next to him. He had been thinking, before he dozed off, about the ship's water recycler. It had been producing water with a faint copper taste for 6 weeks. He had considered reporting it to Lena. Decided it had crossed from problem into character. Eaten the sandwich. Gone to sleep. The skin beam moved across the hull of the carrion wake like a question nobody had thought to ask before. The ship flew on and did not answer. The biological skin came in at the start of the 2nd hour. Toon had been waiting for it. The biological data was always the clearest part of any scan. Living things were consistent. Carbon-based biology, humanoid type, the Dominion database had full profiles on the human species going back to first contact. Toon knew what to expect. He had run biological scans on humans before. They were fragile by Varith standards, warm-blooded, relatively short-lived, prone to stress responses that showed up clean on every sensor they had. He read the first line of the report. He read it again. Then he sat very still for a moment, in the way that a person sits still when the thing in front of them doesn't match any folder in their brain. The crew of the carrion wake was injured. Not all of them. Not catastrophically. But 3 of the 12 showed active injury markers that, by Varith medical standards, would result in immediate removal from duty and mandatory rest protocol. The Dominion took crew health seriously. An injured crew member was an inefficient crew member. An inefficient crew member was a risk to the ship. The math was simple and the rules were clear. The ship's medic, Nina Garrett, 34 years old, from a small town in a region of Earth called Ohio, had a fracture in the lower section of her left forearm. The scan was precise about this. The bone was cracked. The injury was recent, maybe 4 days old. Her pain receptors were active. She was feeling it. She was in the medbay, moving around, lifting things, running equipment with both hands. Toon flagged this in his report. Move to the next entry. The weapons officer, Danny Rourke, had 2 cracked ribs on his right side. The scan caught the stress patterns in the bone clearly. His pain receptors were also active, actually more active than Garrett's, since rib injuries produced a broad, consistent pain signal that was hard to filter out. The Verith had no medical scenario in which a crew member with 2 cracked ribs was considered fit for active duty. The scan showed Rourke standing at his weapons station. Working. Then it showed his biosigns shift slightly, the pattern that Toon's instruments identified as laughter. He was laughing at something. With cracked ribs. The muscles involved in that particular action pulled directly across the injury site. The pain signal in his reading spiked sharply when it happened. He kept laughing. Toon stopped typing for a moment. Started again. The engineer, Lena Park, had a burn across her right palm, a plasma contact burn, the kind that came from handling an open conduit without proper shielding. 6 days old, according to the tissue healing markers. She had wrapped it in cloth. Some kind of woven material, not medical grade. The scan could see the wrap. Could see the injury beneath it. Could see her using that hand to work on the ship's engine corridor, her fingers moving around the burn the way water moves around a rock. Toon wrote his entry. Looked at the 3 names lined up in the injury column of his report. Looked at the corresponding duty status column, which showed all 3 of them as active, mobile, and functional. He typed, instrument error, probable. Looked at it. The words felt hollow in a way they hadn't before. He deleted them. The stress hormone readings were the next thing that didn't fit anywhere clean. The Dominion had a well-documented understanding of how intelligent species responded to danger. Stress hormones spiked in the presence of threat. High enough levels of stress hormones triggered what the database called crisis response, elevated heart rate, narrowed focus, the biological preparation for fight or retreat. In Verith physiology, certain stress hormone thresholds triggered automatic shutdown of non-essential functions. It was a mercy built into their bodies. The system protected them from pushing past what their biology could safely handle. The human crew of the Carrion Wake had stress hormone levels that, translated into Verith equivalents, would indicate a population in the middle of an acute crisis event. Every single one of them. Not the 3 who were injured. All 12. Toon pulled up the behavioral scan alongside the hormone data and put them next to each other on his screen. He looked at both for a long time. The behavioral scan showed normal movement patterns throughout the ship. Normal vocalization, conversation, in the mess hall, 2 crew members eating and talking. Social bonding behavior, the database called it. The instruments in the crew quarters showed 3 off-duty crew members doing off-duty things. One was reading. One appeared to be doing some kind of physical exercise in a very small space. One was lying down with her eyes open, not sleeping, just resting. Looking at the ceiling. At the helm, Pete Callahan's stress hormones were elevated the same as everyone else's. His behavioral scan showed him asleep. He had gone to sleep with a body full of stress hormones, in a ship flying through contested space, on a hull held together with cargo plating and old mining parts. Toon stared at this. The Verith had courage. He wanted to be clear about this in his own mind. The Dominion had never lacked for brave soldiers, capable crews, officers who faced danger without breaking. They were not a fearful species. But Verith courage worked a specific way. It worked by calculation, by understanding a threat clearly enough to see that it was manageable, and moving forward on that understanding. It was rational. It was clean. What he was reading was not that. The humans were afraid. The data said so. Their bodies were running the full chemical signature of creatures that understood they were in danger. And they were, eating lunch together, laughing with cracked ribs, fixing things with burned hands, taking naps. Their fear was present. It was just not in charge. Toon didn't have a database category for this. He opened a new field in his report and sat with the cursor blinking for a moment before he closed it without typing anything. OSSVEL came to stand behind him. He looked at the 2 columns, the hormone data and the behavioral scan, side by side. He said nothing for a while. In the medbay of the Carrion Wake, Nina Garrett finished her equipment check. She'd been going through the inventory the same way she did every few days, not because she was worried, exactly, but because knowing what you had was its own kind of comfort. She knew every bandage, every dosage, every piece of equipment in that room. She knew which drawer stuck and which scanner ran slightly warm and which supply she was going to need to requisition before the next month was out. She rolled her left wrist carefully. The fracture ached the way it always ached, a dull, patient thing that sat in the bone and didn't move. She'd wrapped it properly. It would heal. She had work to do in the meantime. She started humming. Something low and tuneless. She didn't notice she was doing it. 14 corridors away, the Verith skin beam read her biosigns, the pain in her arm, the stress hormones moving through her blood, the steady rhythm of her heart, and reported back to Tuan's station with numbers that still didn't fit anywhere. She hummed. She checked her inventory. She did not know she was being watched. She did not change a single thing about herself because of it. Tuan looked at his screen for a long time. He closed the behavioral column. Opened his report. Wrote one line at the bottom of the biological section, below all the data, below all the flags and cross-references and careful measurements. He wrote, "These readings are internally consistent." He didn't know what else to say about them. He saved the report. Outside, in the dark between the two ships, the skin beam continued its patient work. The Carrion Wake moved through the veil steady and slow, 12 people inside it carrying fear in their bodies the way some things carry water, not consumed by it. Just full of it. Still moving. Thinking Lena Park was talking to the ship again. The audio capture picked it up in the third hour of the scan. Tuan's station flagged it as crew-to-crew communication, a voice, moving through the engine corridor, speaking in a low and even tone. The translation software processed it. The spatial analysis confirmed only one life sign in the corridor. She was not talking to another crew member. She was talking to the ship. Tuan had the translation on his screen. He read it twice, slowly. She was explaining what she was doing to the plasma conduit junction, walking through each step out loud, the way you might explain something to someone who was listening but couldn't respond. She used the ship's name once. Carrion Wake, said in the tone of someone who had used a name so many times it had become less a label and more a habit. She told the ship that she was going to have to pull the secondary coupling out again and that she was sorry about it, but it kept running hot and she needed it to hold for another 6 weeks and she was doing her best. Tuan stared at his screen for a long moment. He did not flag this as instrument error. He had stopped doing that. He just logged it and moved on, because that was all he could do. HFY came and read the translation over his shoulder. He didn't say anything. He went back to the weapons station. The weapons data was where the skin deck went quiet. Not loudly quiet. Not the silence of alarm, more the silence of a room full of professionals who had been trained to present data without reaction, and were being tested on that training harder than they ever had been before. The analysts kept their faces calm. They kept typing. But the room got quieter, in the same gradual way that a room gets warmer when enough people are in it. The Carrion Wake's expected weapons loadout was in the database. 6 forward railguns. 2 missile bays. Standard point defense clusters distributed across the hull. It was a medium frigate. The Dominion's tactical models had run engagement projections on this class of human vessel dozens of times. They were manageable. They were known. The scan found the 6 railguns. 5 of them came back within normal parameters, worn, old, running on a power system that was clearly not receiving the maintenance it was supposed to, but functional. The 6th one was different. The scan could see that it was operational. It could see that it was connected to the ship's main power line. It could see that the housing was intact. It could also see that part of the internal mounting assembly had been replaced. Not with a spare part. With a length of copper pipe. Non-standard gauge. Cut to fit. Held in place with what the skin identified as a mechanical fastening method that was not used in any military hardware the Dominion had on file, because it was a method used in civilian plumbing fixtures. The railgun was held together, in part, by plumbing hardware. It was also, by the scan's projection, fully operational. The 2 missile bays came back next. They were loaded. They were loaded at 140% of their rated capacity, which meant someone had put more missiles in them than the bay was designed to hold, had adjusted the internal rack system to fit them, and had done this deliberately and with enough skill that the bays were still functional and the ship hadn't had a catastrophic loading failure. Toon ran the math on the probability of a missile bay staying stable at 140% capacity. He looked at the number the calculation gave him. He did not share it with the room. The third weapons reading was the one that stopped OSS Vel mid-step. There was a system on the carrion wake that was not in any database the Dominion had on file. Not a gap in the records. Not a classified designation they hadn't been able to crack. It simply did not exist in any catalog of human military hardware that Dominion intelligence had spent years compiling. Toon spent 40 minutes trying to match it to something known. He checked human military records, civilian tech, experimental platforms, prototype databases. He found nothing. He sent a query to the intelligence archive on the command ship. The reply came back in 10 minutes, no match found. The system had been built by someone on the ship. The scan could see the components it was made from. Parts of the ship's secondary water heating system. A targeting module that had been physically modified, rewired, by the look of it, with steady hands and a lot of patience, until it did something different from what it was made to do. Power feeds running from 3 separate systems on the ship, braided together, feeding into a single output point that was aimed along the same axis as the forward railguns. OSS Vel looked at the scan projection of what this improvised system would do if fired. He looked at it for a long time. It was, by every measure the instruments could apply, extremely dangerous. Whether it was dangerous to the carrion wake or dangerous to whatever it was aimed at was a question the scan could not fully answer. Probably both. The system was not safe. It was not clean. It had been built by someone who knew what they wanted it to do and had made it do the thing regardless of what materials they had to work with. Who built this? OSS Vel asked. Toon pulled up the crew manifest. Cross-referenced duty assignments. The weapons officer, he said. Danny Rourke. The scan shows him at that station for an average of 4 additional hours per rest cycle over the past 8 months. 8 months. Rourke had spent 8 months of his off hours building a weapons system from water heater parts and rewired targeting hardware. With 2 cracked ribs, currently. Laughing. OSS Vel pulled up the full comparison he'd been putting off running. He put the carrion wake's profile next to a standard Verith frigate of equivalent size and let the numbers sit side by side. The Verith frigate, 94% structural integrity. Active cooling on all primary systems, running as designed, maintained on a regular schedule by a dedicated engineering crew. Triple redundant navigation. Crew comfort ratings in the upper range of all Dominion vessels. The carrion wake, 31% structural integrity. Cooling system in the secondary corridor manually bypassed. That was Lena Park's work. The skin had found it in the second hour, a bypass she'd installed 2 years ago when the automated system kept running hot. She had taken the automated system offline and run everything herself ever since. It had not failed. Navigation running on a hybrid of factory hardware and civilian components that Pete Callahan had ordered and installed himself. A hull that was 14 different kinds of metal. A piece of a mining platform on the rear. A railgun held together with plumbing. A missile bay at 140%. A weapon that had never existed before one crew member decided to build it. The ship should have been a museum exhibit. It should have been a cautionary lesson in fleet maintenance briefings. It should have been, by every number on OSS Vel's screen, dead. It was pointed at Verith space. It was flying there on purpose. In the captain's chair on the bridge of the carrion wake, Cole Merritt was reading. An actual paper book, not a screen, not a data pad. A physical book, worn at the spine, held together with a strip of tape that had been replaced at least twice by the color variation. He turned a page. He looked up at the view screen, at the stars, at the dark space ahead of them. He had known they were being scanned for about 40 minutes. The ship's passive detection systems weren't much, but they were enough for that. He had read the alert when it came up on the small secondary screen to the left of his chair. He had looked at it for a moment. He had gone back to his book. He was waiting to see what the Verith decided. He was, in his body and in his face and in the pace of his reading, not particularly worried about it. This was the one thing the skin could not find and could not measure. It had no instrument for it. It had no category for a captain who knew he was in the sights of a Dominion survey vessel and responded by turning a page. OSSVEL stood at the center of the skin deck and looked at his data and understood, in a slow and uncomfortable way, that he was going to have to write a report unlike any he had written before. He didn't start it yet. He stood there a little longer. The audio capture had been running passively the whole time. That was standard. The Dominion always collected audio alongside the structural and biological data, crew voices, internal communications, background sounds. It fed into the intelligence archive. Most of it was filed and never reviewed. There was too much of it. A ship full of people produced too much noise for any analyst to sort through in real time. But Toon was thorough. That was, historically, his best quality and occasionally his worst one. He ran his processes all the way to the end even when most people would have stopped. So while OSSVEL was drafting the structural comparison and the rest of the skin deck was processing the weapons data, Toon was running the audio. The translation came through slowly. Human language, American English dialect, colloquial register. The translation software was good, but human language was dense with things that didn't transfer cleanly: rhythm, tone, the particular weight a word carried depending on who was saying it and how. Toon read the first translation pass. He read it again. He checked the spatial data to make sure he had the right room. He did. The mess hall. 4 crew members. The biological scan confirmed it, 4 life signs, clustered together, stationary. They were singing. Not for any reason Toon could identify. Not a ceremony. Not a distress signal. Not communication directed outward. They were just singing. In the mess hall of a ship being scanned by a Dominion survey vessel in contested frontier space, approximately 1 hour before OSSVEL was going to make his tactical decision about what to do with the carrion wake. Toon pulled up which 4. The weapons officer, Danny Rourke, had apparently started it. The translation software struggled with the first section. It was a song about a sports team, something called a football club, from the city Rourke was from. The software flagged multiple words as culturally specific without equivalence. What came through clearly was that the team had not won very much, and the song was about this, and it was not a sad song. It was not a proud song either. It was something in between, the kind of song you sang about a thing you loved even though it had let you down repeatedly, maybe because it had let you down repeatedly, because the loving of it and the surviving of the letting down had become the same feeling after enough years. Pete Callahan had picked it up partway through the first verse. Then Nina Garrett. Then Lena Park, who, the translation software noted with what Toon could only read as computational confusion, did not appear to know all the words. She was substituting. The replacement scanned correctly if you weren't paying close attention, which meant she had some experience doing this with songs she didn't fully know. Toon flagged the audio. Wrote a report entry. Looked at it sitting there on his screen. His cursor hovered over the entry. He had written, crew engaging in social vocalization behavior, pre-engagement ritual, possible, and he looked at that phrase and felt, for the first time in his career, that the phrase did not do any justice at all to the thing he was describing. Their stress hormones were still elevated. All 4 of them. Their bodies were still running the chemical signature of creatures that understood they were close to danger. And they were singing about a football team. Badly. With incorrect words in some places. With what the emotional tone analysis identified as genuine feeling throughout, not performed calm, not bravado, but something that the software listed as complex positive effect with grief undertones, which was the closest it could get to naming what it was hearing. Toon closed the analysis column. He did not want the software's approximation. He sat with the raw audio for a moment instead, the actual sound of 4 voices, not quite in harmony, committed to something that only made complete sense if you had grown up on a planet that spent most of its history finding small reasons to hold together in the dark. He had not grown up on that planet. He didn't have the context for it. He had only the data. 4 people, afraid, sitting in a mess hall, singing a losing team's song an hour before the ship they lived on might be destroyed. The fear was still there. The data was clear about that. The fear had not gone anywhere. They had just put something next to it. Something that was not the opposite of fear but that kept it company. Made it smaller by comparison. Made it possible to sit with. Toon turned around in his chair. OSSVEL was standing across the room, reviewing the final section of the weapons report. "Sir," Toon said. OSSVEL looked up. Toon had been in the Dominion Survey Corps for 30 years. He had never, in 30 years, asked a question in a professional context that he did not already have a framework for answering. Questions without frameworks were not questions he asked out loud. They were things he resolved privately, through research and analysis, until they had an answer and could be filed correctly. He did not have a framework for this one. He asked it anyway. "What do we call a species that knows it can die," he said, "and does this anyway?" He gestured at the audio output on his screen. The four voices. The song. OSSVEL looked at it. He looked at it for a long time. Long enough that the silence became its own kind of answer, not because he was deciding what to say, but because he genuinely did not know. He had commanded survey operations for 20 years. He had scanned hundreds of ships. He had written tactical disposition reports on dozens of species. He had a framework for all of them. Even the difficult ones. Even the ones who surprised him. There was always, eventually, a category. He didn't answer Toon. He went back to his screen. The weapons report. The copper pipe in the railgun. The missile bays at 140%. The hand-built weapons system that didn't exist in any catalog. The burn on Lena Park's hand. The fracture in Nina Garrett's arm. The cracked ribs and the laughter. The nap. The paper book. And now this. Four voices in a mess hall, holding fear in their hands like something familiar, singing about a team that had lost more than it had won, doing it with feeling, doing it together, because whatever it did to the fear, it did something. It changed the shape of it. Made it possible to carry into whatever came next. He opened the audio file. He listened. He sat with it the way Toon had sat with it. Without the analysis column. Without the software's approximations. Just the sound. On the Verith command ship, 14 kilometers distant, Fleet Admiral Darahas was receiving OSSVEL's reports as they came in. She had been following the scan data for the past 3 hours. She was a patient woman, patient even by Verith standards, and she had read each entry without comment, waiting for the picture to complete itself. She received the audio file with Toon's flag and opened it. She listened to the four voices. The sports team. The words that were sometimes right and sometimes not. The emotional tone reading, which the software rendered as complex positive effect with grief undertones, which told her exactly nothing useful and also everything. She turned off her audio channel. She sat in the dark of her command office for a moment. She was thinking about the number 31%. She was thinking about copper plumbing in a railgun housing. She was thinking about what it meant to build a weapon from water heater parts and then sing about a losing football team an hour before you found out if anyone was going to fire it. She was thinking about the Dominion's expansion model. 60 years of it. The core assumption at the center of it, the one that had always held, the one that every successful campaign was built on, that resistance, under sufficient pressure, ended. That every species had a breaking point. That the math of survival, clearly enough presented, would eventually produce submission. She was not sure, sitting in the dark with four voices still echoing in her, that this assumption had been tested against the right kind of data before today. 2 corridors away from the mess hall, Cole Merritt stood outside the door. He had heard them from the bridge. He put his book down and walked. He stood outside now, one hand resting loosely on the wall beside the door frame, listening. He didn't go in. He listened to all four of them. The song. The wrong words in the right places. The thing underneath it that kept them all going. He nodded once at nothing in particular. Went back to the bridge. Picked up his book. Turned to the page where he'd left off. OSSVEL wrote his report. It took him longer than any report he had written in 20 years. Not because the data was incomplete. The data was thorough, 6 hours of scan readings across every system the Dominion Survey Corps had at its disposal, cross-referenced and analyzed and logged with the precision that the Corps trained for and demanded. The data was the most complete picture of a single enemy vessel that OSSVEL had ever produced. The problem was the tactical disposition box at the end of the report. The box that every survey report ended with. The box where the surveyor recommended what to do next: strike, monitor, retreat, engage. The box that OSSVEL had filled in on 400 previous reports without hesitation, because the data always pointed somewhere and his job was to read where it pointed and say so clearly. He sat with the cursor in the box for a long time. He thought about 31% structural integrity. He thought about the copper pipe. He thought about the burn on Lena Park's hand and the way she'd wrapped it in cloth and kept working. He thought about Pete Callahan asleep at the helm. He thought about the song in the mess hall, and Toon's question, and the fact that he still did not have an answer for it. A strike on the carrion wake was, on paper, simple. The ship was outgunned. The hull was compromised. One well-placed torpedo and the thing would break along the 14 seams where 14 different metals met each other, and whatever was left would drift. That was the arithmetic. That was what the weapons data said. But OSSVEL was a tactician before he was anything else. And a tactician did not stop at the arithmetic of one ship. He thought about the ship that was behind the ship. He thought about the fleet that was behind the fleet. He thought about the civilization that had produced a species that took a dying vessel past every rational threshold, held it together with spare parts and stubbornness, crewed it with people who worked through injuries that should have grounded them, built weapons from water heater components in their off hours, and sang about losing sports teams an hour before potential annihilation. And he thought, this is not unusual for them. That was the thing. The carrion wake was not a special case. The database had other records, other ships, other crews, other instances of humans doing things with equipment that was not supposed to work, in conditions that were not supposed to be survivable, past every deadline that biology and physics and basic engineering said should have been the end. It was a pattern. The carrion wake was just a very complete example of the pattern. Which meant the Dominion's expansion model had a problem at its center. The model said, apply enough pressure, and resistance ends. It had been right for 60 years. It had been right about every species the Dominion had encountered and absorbed. There was always a breaking point. There was always a threshold beyond which the math became undeniable and submission followed. The model assumed that breaking points existed. OSSVEL looked at his skin data. Looked at 12 people inside a ship at 31% structural integrity, flying toward Verith space, afraid and functional and singing. He left the tactical disposition box empty. He sent the report to Fleet Admiral Darahas. In 20 years, he had never sent a report without a tactical recommendation. His hands were steady when he sent it. His mind was not. Darahas received it. She read through it the same way she had read each individual update, carefully, from the beginning, without skipping. She had already seen the biological data, the structural data, the weapons data, the audio. She had already sat in the dark with the song. Reading the full assembled report was different from reading the pieces of it. The full picture had a weight to it that the pieces didn't. It sat on the desk and said something that none of the individual numbers said alone. It said, you have been measuring the wrong thing. The Dominion's expansion model measured capability, firepower, hull integrity, resource levels, population numbers, how much a species could bring to bear, and whether that was enough to match what the Dominion brought. When the numbers said no, and they almost always said no, the model predicted the end of meaningful resistance. The model had never been asked to measure what people did when the numbers said no and they kept going anyway. It had no tool for that. It had no column for it. There was no field in any Dominion tactical assessment for the space between what the math said should happen and what actually happened when the people involved decided, on no rational basis, that the math was wrong. Darahas looked at the empty tactical disposition box in OSSVEL's report for a long time. She understood why he had left it empty. She would have left it empty too. She called her senior communications officer. She told her to prepare a diplomatic channel to Human Fleet Command. Not a demand. Not an ultimatum. A channel, an open line, the kind you established when you wanted to talk to someone rather than at them. Her communications officer paused. This was unusual. The Dominion did not typically open diplomatic channels in the middle of an active skin operation in a frontier zone. It meant something. It meant the survey had produced a conclusion that was different from the usual conclusions, and that the usual response was therefore also not applicable. Yes, Admiral, the officer said, and went to set it up. Daraha sat alone at her desk. She pulled up the audio file again. The four voices. The song. The grief underneath it and the thing that kept them going anyway. She listened to the end of it this time. She had cut it short before, in the dark, because she had needed a moment to think. Now she let it run. It ended the way those kinds of songs ended. Not with resolution. Not with an answer. With the people in it still standing, still together, the losing still true and the love of the thing still also true, both of those facts sitting side by side without canceling each other out. She closed the file. Cole Merritt got the alert that someone was opening a diplomatic channel 14 minutes later. It came through on the secondary screen to the left of his chair. He looked at it. He looked at the designation, Verith Dominion, Fleet Command Level, Formal Diplomatic Classification. He put his book down. Pete, he said. Callahan was awake. He'd been awake for a while, actually. He had quietly woken himself up when the passive detection pinged the survey beam, and had been sitting at the helm with his eyes half open, monitoring, eating the last of a protein bar he'd found in his jacket pocket. He looked alert in the way that people looked alert when they had been trained to go from asleep to functional in under 10 seconds and had practiced it enough that the transition was invisible. Yeah, Callahan said. Hold our course, Merritt said. Don't change anything. Copy that, Callahan said. Merritt looked at the channel request. He thought about what it meant that a Dominion Fleet Admiral was asking to talk instead of asking to shoot. He thought about the 6 hours they had spent being scanned. He thought about his crew, Lena talking to the ship in the engine corridor, Danny laughing at his own station, Nina humming while she worked, the four of them singing in the mess hall. He thought about the ship. Old, patched, held together by things that were never supposed to hold anything together. Flying anyway. He accepted the channel. He leaned forward in his chair. Folded his hands on the console in front of him. His voice, when he spoke, was the same as it always was, even, unhurried, like he had all the time in the world and every word in it was worth taking care of. This is Captain Cole Merritt of the UES Carrion Wake, he said. Go ahead. The stars outside the view screen were still and quiet. The ship moved through them the same way it had been moving for the past 6 hours, steady, slow, 31% structural integrity, 14 kinds of metal in the hull, a piece of a mining platform on its back, pointed forward. It did not know it had just changed something. It flew on.